Hey everyone, good morning. My name is Jack Bratich. I'm a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University and author of On Microfascism, Gender, War, and Death, which is over on the table. Today's panel, I'm happy to be able to chair today's panel on communicating anti-fascism strategies, tactics, and implications. As we'll see, often people think about communication as just like conveying messages or information, but what we'll see today is communication is more than that. It's a way of kind of creating and composing the anti-fascist collective body as well, both materially, linguistically, and a fusion of those. So we will jump right into our first panelist, who's Matthew Parnell. Matt is a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication Arts and Science at Penn State University. He's currently working on his dissertation, which investigates the rhetoric of the American Nazi movement during the 1930s. And the talk Matthew's given today is called Free Capitol Hill, the Rhetorical Anti-Fascism of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. So please welcome Matt.
Is this good? Awesome. So the project I'm about to present is kind of a work in progress. I wrote this during my PhD coursework, and now that I'm post-comps ABD, I'm going to come back to it and hopefully submit it to publication somewhere, but I'm interested to know what you all think about this. On the night of June 8th, 2020, protesters associated with several Black Lives Matter and minority liberation groups descended upon the Seattle Police Department's East Precinct building located in the glamorous Capitol Hill district. The building, boarded up and vacated, became the birthplace of a larger movement against police brutality. The Capitol Hill occupied protest, or for the purposes of this presentation, the CHOP. Ranging multiple blocks throughout the district, participants created a community that shared advice, educational materials, and necessities like food, water, and shelter. Within the CHOP, activists created a police-free space where people could collaborate, create, and innovate together, often in communities of love outside the guise of police interference. Residents led teach-ins, lectures, and mutual aid drives, all of which brought awareness to issues of anti-Blackness and anti-fascism within governmental institutions. My presentation today is concerned with how the CHOP occupied and exemplified a particular ethic of anti-fascism that centers anti-racism as a key component of its praxis. Fascism, as broadly defined by Robert Paxton, is a political ideology that is concerned with community decline, humiliation, and victimhood. At its core, fascism marshals deeply racist cultural perspectives to justify the targeting, harassment, and elimination of non-white populations. Admittingly so, my disciplinary perspective is that of a rhetorical critic. Thus, the following perspective on fascism, anti-fascism, as well as issues related to anti-racism come from the notion that all of these are communicative processes that flow both outward from cultural institutions as well as from average people. Fascism through a rhetorical perspective is best understood by a process by which people, media, and cultural texts invite audiences to embrace fascism's various logics of scapegoating, economic protectionism, intense racism, and demagogic deliberation. Strangely enough, the field of rhetoric has done little work on fascism, with only a few books really dedicated to unpacking the types of rhetorical strategies that undergird fascism's appeal. Anti-fascism is an oppositional force to fascism's violent rhetorical pleas has received even less attention from my field. Greenwald defines anti-fascism as active opposition to explicitly fascist movements, as well as groups spreading hate and narratives of national victimage. Much like fascism, anti-fascism is a deeply rhetorical process in which anti-fascist movements must find the means of persuasion to understand how the masses can reject and ultimately destroy fascism. While many anti-fascist groups view struggles against racism and police brutality as deeply linked with the fight against fascism, again, little rhetorical work actually seeks to understand how contemporary anti-fascist movements engage with anti-racism as an organizing principle. Thus, my research today attempts to tease out some of the relationships between anti-fascism and anti-racist ideologies from an inherently rhetorical perspective. Now, this isn't to say that anti-fascism solely means being anti-racist, but given the scope of this project, I chose to focus more on the anti-racist aspects of the CHOP. This project examines the CHOP's anti-fascist rhetorics to help us better conceptualize anti-fascist activism that is more firmly rooted in commitments to anti-racism. My methodology is situated in rhetorical criticism inspired by the work of Michael Layth, who suggests that rhetorical criticism is the practice of locating cultural texts and examining the persuasive appeals that emerge from it. This is, of course, a work in progress, but now my argument is that the CHOP, via its use of film, music, and speech, rhetorically created an anti-fascist space that privileged vulnerable voices. My methodology involved examining tweets, testimonials, news reports, as well as accounts from activists who labored in the CHOP. To make my argument, the presentation broadly makes 3 moves. I first situate the CHOP as an anti-fascist activist space. Secondarily, I look at the CHOP's rhetorical life as it constitutes anti-fascism with key tenets of anti-racism at the core. Finally, I ponder what this means going forward as we attempt to redefine and refocus our anti-fascist activism, specifically through the lens of a scholarly activist paradigm. The first major stasis point I want to broach is defining the CHOP through an anti-fascist lens. Anti-fascist is, I think, after we've discovered over yesterday, an admittedly broad term, with the term being appropriated and exploited by the American right to argue that anti-fascist groups are often themselves fascist. To make this exceedingly clear today, I argue that any movement that is firmly and unconditionally opposed to fascism should be constituted as anti-fascist. The CHOP was founded by an incredibly diverse and diffuse coalition that was in direct opposition to fascist anti-black police brutality. To be clear, police brutality represents one of the most clear and overt forms of fascism in American political culture. American law enforcement has countlessly demonstrated a commitment to violence, especially against people of color, as evidenced by the rising numbers of people of color being murdered by police. We have plenty of evidence, most famously articulated by Michael German, that far-right militiamen and white supremacists have infiltrated our local police departments. Carl Boggs argues that law enforcement's commitment to white supremacist violence, along with constant victimhood, means that they represent one of the most violent forms of police brutality in the United States. Given American law enforcement's embracement of fascist violence, the CHOP acted as a direct condemnation of this violence itself. For example, the demands were threefold. First, they demanded that Seattle cut their police budget by 50%. Second, they demanded a shift in Seattle funding to community programs and services for black residents. And finally, they demanded that protesters would not be charged with crimes. From June 8th to July 1st, the CHOP formed a no-cop zone, with food, medical supplies, and goods distributed to CHOP residents. The atmosphere at the CHOP was not always stable and peaceful, as there were reports of young white men marching with guns, as well as the occasional dispute between local businesses and protesters. However, the CHOP operated primarily as a space for activists to engage in community discussion, discourse, and consciousness raising. The area spanned multiple blocks and was marked off specifically with barricades to prevent police from coming in the first place. And near the end of June, Mayor Jenny Durkin deemed the CHOP as too dangerous and issued an executive order to mobilize police and take back the space. Now that I've kind of situated the CHOP from a historical perspective, I want to turn to the rhetorical character of the CHOP itself. While the movement was anti-fascist, the types of discourse and public deliberation embodied anti-racism as well. As a rhetorical scholar, I am frequently interested in how cultural texts such as film, music, and speech work to invite audiences to embrace, reject, and embody various forms of ideological frameworks. Thus, my research here looks at 3 different cultural texts as they appeared in the CHOP. First, I look at film. Which is the first significant rhetorical text that this project grapples with, is how film was used as an anti-fascist and anti-racist tool of the CHOP. Movie screenings were a fairly regular event. In the days following the protest creation, makeshift film screens were constructed that allowed audiences to watch any number of films that centered around notions of social justice, inclusivity, and mutual respect. These outdoor theaters screened films about systemic racism. Videos of the film screenings posted on Twitter depict a community that came together to learn about important concepts related to white supremacy with snacks, water, and support provided to viewers to make sense of what's happening on the screen. I think there are 2 relevant points of interest that I want to draw your attention to about the use of film in this space. First, the films feature narratives and stories from otherwise marginalized populations as a means to fuse the anti-fascist politics of the CHOP with an anti-racist perspective of the audience. There are 2 films that received significant attention in the mainstream press as well as Twitter. The first film was the famous 2016 documentary 13th. The film examines a history of complex intersections of racism, social justice, and mass incarceration in the United States. This film is culturally significant considering that it places a heavy focus on the disproportionate impact that criminalization and mass incarceration has on communities of color. The second film that was featured is Paris is Burning, which, directed by Jenny Livingston, explores the intersection of race, class, and gender in the ballroom culture in New York City in the 1980s. Much like 13th, this film attempts to understand how socially negotiated and constructed forms of anti-black violence are enacted upon vulnerable communities. As Fernando Ramos Arenas argues in 2016, film as a site of textual production can operate as a means of political activism via its representational and narrative dimensions. Furthermore, Frederick Jameson suggests that film orients viewers towards particular ideological viewpoints through aesthetic and symbolic qualities, forming the foundation for political subjecthood, for example, the people at the CHOP who are watching the films. Through watching these films at the CHOP's anti-fascist side of protest, viewers were invited by these showings to contextualize, or for some, recontextualize, their anti-fascist frameworks through a deeply anti-racist and furthermore an anti-law enforcement lens. The second major point related to film is that showing a film at a protest is rather transgressive. We tend to think of protests as places of constant movement, where we are chanting, marching, doing any number of actions. To watch a film, you have to stop. The showing of film implies a certain level of rhetorical stoppage where we sit together and watch what's happening on the screen. This runs counter to how we tend to think about a protest in a lot of cases. Specifically, I argue that this discourse that emerges post-film, so what ended up happening in a lot of cases were a CHOP attendees got together to talk about the central tenets of the film, and ultimately these discussions bled over into other forms of discourse of the CHOP. Additionally, rhetorical studies should consider how mediums such as film then can act as a gateway to open up new discussions of anti-racist and anti-fascist imaginaries. For example, the case study provided by the CHOP acts as a starting point for rhetoricians and scholars alike to consider how film can be used to form political communities mid-protest that can better refine the way that we approach our activism. Film isn't the only cultural text that's present at the CHOP. I also look at the use of music as a means to do consciousness raising for anti-fascist and anti-racist activists. Live music and poetry readings were essential frameworks for cultivating significant consciousness raising during the CHOP's existence. Throughout June, a number of bands congregated within the CHOP borders. While a number of local acts took the stage of the CHOP, the most reported on example is that of Marshall Hugh and his famous martial law band. He said that he wanted to bring his band to bring the vibes to the people that were constantly going to be at the CHOP night in and night out. So he got the martial law band with activist Julie C. and set up a set at the intersection of 11th Avenue and East Pike Street. A reporter from the Seattle Times noted that these sets typically consisted of extended jam sessions that weaved cross-cultural sounds together that included soul music, R&B, funk, and reggae. Many times, speakers of the CHOP invited the martial law band to speak behind them as they gave passionate anti-racist speeches. Additionally, musicians from a number of indigenous tribes from across Washington as well as the United States gathered at the CHOP to play music on traditional indigenous instruments. For example, members of the Lakota tribe performed on percussion instruments and sang songs that circulated amongst their community. The musical dimension of the CHOP is relevant to its anti-fascist nature because it contributes to the cultural ontology of the protest through the sonic aesthetic. Gooding, Yanma, and Salter suggest that music in the space of the protest generates messages of resistance through symbolic embodiment and expressions of solidarity. Musicians at the CHOP use their platform to one, center non-Western sounds, and two, use the music to accentuate the surrounding activism, such as when the martial law band played softly behind speakers to boost the emotional appeal of the message. While, of course, the inclusion of non-Western sounds I think is rhetorically significant, that's not my takeaway here. Instead, I want to argue that music works to elicit particular responses that shape a given protester's outlook towards the political life of the protest. Rosenberg argues that at a protest, and protest generally, music works to elicit an emotional response that forms the foundation of how a listener will relate themselves to the protest around them. There is a considerable amount of queer and feminist research that argues that these affective responses kind of form the bedrock of how we approach our political subjecthood, and in the case of the CHOP, I think that non-Western and non-traditional music and sounds position listeners to at least be opening to embrace decolonial and similar anti-racist outlooks. This is also relevant considering that most of the music played at the CHOP were jams, which is like a free-flowing kind of, mix and match type of music that I think constitutes a fairly significant portion of the rhetorical life of this movement. Finally, I look at a very traditional rhetorical text in this project, which is speakers. Considering I do public address work, which is the study of how do we speak in public, I look at oratory as the final kind of rhetorical life of this movement. As Stephen Brown notes, oratory has been the staple of protest movements dating back to the early days of the American Revolution. The CHOP featured a number of speakers across a wide spectrum of ideological standpoints, but the most common speeches centered around the anti-racist efforts in the city of Seattle. For example, a number of activists spoke on makeshift stages about the violent police brutality enacted upon people of color within the city. What strikes me as the most important is that regular protesters were encouraged to speak. I think the CHOP is an interesting site because it flips a lot of the logics of what we typically think as a protest on their head. Not only are there film screenings, there's music, but average people are encouraged and invited to engage in the discourse. For example, there were specific zones dedicated for public deliberation and debate by CHOP residents. Furthermore, these discussions included the future of movements such as BLM and various anti-fascist groups within the state of Washington. Clearly, the CHOP valued participation of average protesters, as a lot of these debates would go on into the late hours of the night. I think the oratory life of this movement is unique. Protests typically often will not make space for individuals to speak their mind, right? Going back to this idea that protest is a site of a confluence of bodily emotion, you move, you chant together in unison. Oftentimes, protests are not sites where people can air their grievances, in a space where they get feedback and you engage in public deliberation. As stated in the film section above, the CHOP was a space for rhetorical stoppage, in which individuals had the opportunity to sit down, process, and engage in meaningful discussions at a personal level. Additionally, protests are best remembered by the most eloquent speakers, something that privileges experience in activism, money, time, etc. In the instance of the CHOP, the fact that the keynote speeches were decentered from just one or two speakers meant that average people could bring their concerns to the table, forming kind of a praxis of community activism, getting people engaged in discussion, and ultimately engaging in the material conditions of those present at the protest, which again is something that we don't see a lot of times in protest movements. To conclude this presentation, I want to meditate for the last four or so minutes on what the CHOP can teach us about anti-fascism and its ties to anti-racism in our current moment. As of this presentation, there have been 787 people murdered by police in the United States this year alone. The rate of fatal police shootings among Black Americans has been much higher than for literally any other racial category, standing at 41 fatal shootings per million as of September 2022. Furthermore, there are thousands and thousands of examples and reports of people being harassed, profiled, and targeted by American police forces. Much of this persecution is directed towards people of color. This suggests that the battle against fascist police violence is of course not yet over and requires anti-fascist scholar activists to remember their commitment to principles of anti-racism as a core tenet of any key anti-fascist movement. This project views the CHOP as a key case study in understanding how anti-fascist movements can utilize cultural texts such as film, music, and speeches to inject anti-racist ideals into the political life of the movement. It would be utopian to claim that the CHOP was a perfect example of a protest. It had its problems, including an unclear, often unifying ethic, along with its occasional acceptance of sometimes armed and questionably white paramilitary presence. The significance of the CHOP lies with the nearly summer-long sway that it held over our popular political discourse. Conservative commentators spent considerable time framing the protests as dangerous sites of anarchy, where Antifa soldiers persecuted white people. Then President Donald Trump even tweeted, "Take back your city now," all caps. "If you don't do it, I will. This is not a game. Those ugly anarchists must be stopped immediately." Even in 2022, the CHOP is frequently mentioned by conservative politicians who compare basically any anti-fascist rally or protest, or even anti-racist protest, to the anarchy that they believe happened at the CHOP. Baseless far-right depictions aside, I think the CHOP serves as an important example of how multiple forms of rhetorical production, such as film, speeches, and music, can all be aimed at characterizing the rhetorical life of an anti-fascist movement. As Guillet implicitly suggests, social movements frequently invite participants to blend ideological positions into coherent discourses that form the foundation of the movement. I argue that within this project, the communicative acts that constitute the CHOP ultimately blend anti-fascism and anti-racism together through the rhetorical dimensions related to form, style, and the aesthetic. I encourage rhetorical scholars and scholars across disciplines to continue to probe anti-fascist discourse. One of the key tenets of rhetorical research is understanding how our rhetoric constitutes our political and social communities. which for those such as Lisa Flores, argues that will allow us to better craft tactics of like anti-fascist violence, or against anti-fascist violence. To end, this project invites me to consider what I believe to be a fundamental tenet in anti-fascist activism. I don't believe one can call themselves anti-fascist unless they are also anti-racist. Fascism nearly always prioritizes and privileges hyper-visible racial violence for the purpose of sustaining white supremacy. This means that our activism in the current moment must be constantly attuned to how we can direct our anti-fascist activism to assist those who are most affected by racist and fascist violence. Now, this isn't to say that anti-fascism is the only tenet of, that anti-racism is the only tenet of anti-fascism. There are important questions related to labor, gender, and other various ideological systems. However, my argument is centered around the notion that to be good anti-fascists, we have to remember to remain committed to anti-racism. Thank you.
If you need it. Okay, let me just introduce you here. If you want to. Okay, thanks, Matt. Up next, we have Paul Lendway, who's a fifth-year PhD candidate in political science at Yale University. His dissertation focuses on understanding the social psychological micro-foundations for how populist appeals work and their implications for democracy. And Paul's title today is What Rhetoric Can Stop a Fascist? Please welcome Paul.
Thanks, Jack, and great job, Matt. I think you outlined your three-paper dissertation there, so that was excellent. And thanks to Mary Ann and Fraser for organizing this. I really think this conference is a model that other universities, such as my own, should really follow, and I hope we do this every year. So the title of the talk, as Jack mentioned, is What Rhetoric Can Stop a Fascist? So disclosure, I'm a populism scholar. My dissertation's on populism. I study the social psychological micro-foundations of how populist appeals work, but I think that could shed insights into how fascist appeals work and how to counter not just populist appeals but also fascist appeals. So as an outline, I'm going to define fascism as it differentiates from populism, put forward my theoretical framework that I call group reclassification theory. Notice it's the acronym is GRT, but I came up with that before they came up with group replacement theory. I'll then go over my experimental results and then talk about the implications that has for countering populism and I think also fascism. I don't want to spend too much time defining fascism because I think Matt and others have done an excellent job the past couple of days to do that. But I do think it's worth thinking about the difference between fascism and populism. Mueller argues the fascist wants to get rid of the minority. The populist needs the minority. And the idea there is the populist needs somebody to rail against, somebody to build the wall against to stop, the corporate executives that are raising prices to then criticize, or a swamp to drain, right? So with that distinction in mind, probably more so with populism than fascism, the definition of populism is under contention. Some argue that it's an ideology, some argue that it's a political strategy, others say it's a discursive frame. The leading definition is the Moody 2004 definition. When I say leading, I say kind of having gone over the populism literature, who I see scholars kind of coalescing around. It's the Moody 2004 definition of populism as a combination of anti-elitism mixed with a thwarting of the good people's will. So you could think of Bernie Sanders on the left, Donald Trump on the right. So we have a sense now of what a populist appeal is, and of course we see that populism is popular, which kind of motivates an interest in understanding how populist appeals operate and what outcomes they affect. So all this little directed acyclical graph shows is we think there are multiple mechanisms through which populist appeals operate and multiple outcomes that they affect. So I ask, how do populist appeals operate, and do they increase support for violations of democratic principles? And to answer that, I put forward and test a theory called group reclassification theory to argue how they increase support for democratic erosion and show that they do increase support for democratic erosion. I don't think I have to spend much time motivating why populism matters to this crowd, but the idea is that the concern is that a populist will use the mantle of democracy for authoritarian ends, right? So, and using the kind of people's thwarted will to justify getting elected, the concern is that the populist will then tear down the system to enact the will. And thinking about the mechanism through which populist appeals operate, blame attribution is commonly mentioned as a leading mechanism, which would be embedded in the anti-elitism component of the populist appeal. But in the work by Busby et al., where they provide empirical evidence for blame attribution, they openly admit that they make no claims that it's the only mechanism, just that it's an important one. And I would argue that blame attribution is the central mechanism that the literature on populist appeals kind of centers on. But what I ask is, if we consider the good people's thwarted will as part of the populist appeal, shouldn't there be some mechanism surrounding that? It's not just anti-elitism, right? Anti-elitism is a component of it. So I ask, what are the other mechanisms? Is there a sort of good people's will mechanism? And then also this question of, do populist appeals increase support for democratic violations? So my main theoretical framework builds on social identity theory, but also Kelman's work on legitimization, delegitimization. And Kelman argues that when you have both legitimization and delegitimization, that basically the concurrence of the two recasts social beliefs and norms, so that, in his paraphrasing, what was previously legitimate becomes illegitimate and vice versa. I argue that that's exactly what populist appeals do, that the good people's thwarted will is the in-group legitimization, and that the anti-elitism is the out-group delegitimization, and that when they work in tandem, that recasts public beliefs and norms to actually value tearing down the democracy. So this is a DAG of my theoretical framework, which has three really simple hypotheses. First, that populist appeals increase in-group legitimization. Second, that they increase out-group delegitimization, so those are my mechanisms. And then the main outcome I'm interested in is support, like mass support for violating democratic principles. So I tested this framework with a set of 4 survey experiments. You see the issues. The first study was COVID, the second was student debt, the third was the filibuster, and the fourth was vote counting. So this was each was a national survey run on Lucid, so nationally representative. Subjects consented, answered basic demographic questions, and then were randomly assigned to one of several conditions. Each condition was shown rhetoric from a politician. That's all it said. Below is rhetoric from a candidate running for office. In the control group, they were shown just the issue. For the good people's will group, they were shown the issue plus the candidate talking about the good people's thwarted will. For the second treatment group, it was the issue plus anti-elitism. And for the last treatment group, it was the issue plus populism. So it's just a staggered approach. So it included the good people's thwarted will with anti-elitism. For COVID, Congress was attacked. For student debt, university leaders were attacked. For the filibuster, the Senate was attacked. For vote counting, state election officials were attacked. The idea here was just to have conceptually distinct issues that I could then aggregate across for this the coefficient plot that you see. And I know it's kind of hard to see. I apologize for that. And I'm still working on making it clear. But basically, if you look kind of on the first column, it shows that the populist appeal increases support for violations of democratic principles, increases candidate electability, increases in-group legitimization, and increases out-group delegitimization. And if you look at the second and third columns, basically what you see is that it's the in-group legitimization that's increasing candidate electability, but the out-group delegitimization that increases support for violations of democratic principles. So hopefully I've convinced you that I have some initial empirical evidence to provide support for this theoretical framework, group reclassification theory, that populist appeals jointly operate through both in-group legitimization and out-group delegitimization, and that in concert they then increase mass support, not just for violating democratic principles, but really democratic erosion. The in-group legitimization gets the populist elected, but the out-group delegitimization increases mass support for breaking down the system. Okay, so I spent a lot of time talking about how populist appeals work, but the title is about countering populism and fascism. So that might be confusing. But the idea is that if we understand how populist appeals work, then we can use those micro-foundations of how populist appeals work to counter them. So if the in-group legitimization and out-group delegitimization are indeed central to how populist appeals work, we can use those mechanisms to sort of reverse engineer populism and counteract it. We could delegitimize the populist. We could, legitimize what was previously delegitimized. Legitimize the news so that it's not fake news. Legitimize Washington, D.C. so that it's not the swamp. I don't necessarily have prescriptives for how to do that, but I think that kind of sets a rhetorical strategy how that could counter populism. And then in thinking about fascism, the sort of process that I just outlined could be done, exactly for fascism. And if any of you want to work on that with me, let me know after the talk. But the idea that we could take the fascist appeal, break it down, disaggregate it into its constituent parts, and then, after getting IRB approval, kind of survey experimentally, see, okay, what part's moving what, to try to isolate what the key mechanisms are, and then the main outcomes that it affects. So that's my research, my dissertation research, at least the first paper in a nutshell. Thank you all for your time.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And we're going to have some time for discussion, too, so that's great. But before that, we have Heather Ann Layth, who's a PhD candidate at Mississippi State University, and whose work is focused on the tactics used by militant anti-fascists. She holds an MA in history from CUNY Staten Island, where she explored the cultural significance of literary portrayals of Spartacus. Her work at the national headquarters of the ACLU during and after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville informs her understanding of anti-fascist organizing. Today's talk by Heather Ann is Tactical Violence, Militant Anti-Fascist Movement, Repertoires, and Meaning. And I know she's going to use your own, so please welcome Heather Ann.
Carefully balance this right on the other one.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Like everybody else, I would like to thank Marianne and Fraser for putting this together, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming here. I'm really excited for this opportunity. Is it up on the screen? Yes, okay, great. Like Jack said, this is part of my dissertation work. I am pretty early in the process of writing my dissertation, so this is going to be pretty theoretical. I don't have data like Paul does yet, so let's take a look at the theory side of how we look at movement tactics. But before we get there, an important feminist principle that I subscribe to is this idea of positionality. And so I would like to think about who is here in the room and who isn't here in the room. Who is doing the talking and who isn't doing the talking, right? And what are our goals for being here, coming together, and looking at these topics? And so if you'd like, you can go to this site or click that QR tag and tell us, how do you identify here in the room, and then we can have a little bit of an idea of who's here. It is going to go away when I go to the next slide, but great idea. All right. Wait for all those little camera snaps. Oh, I'm sorry. It's that Wi-Fi thing, right? Look at that, 80% academics. All right, getting a little bit of a change. If I learned anything, yes, that's not true. I learned a lot of stuff yesterday, but I also learned that some of us are not technologically adept. All right, so we can see it changing in real time as more and more people answer. And so it does look like, while we have a heavy academic presence, which makes sense, we're here at a school, we do have a mix of people in the room, which is important to me. So today I'm going to talk about, I love slides that are difficult to read, so we're going to talk about theories. We're going to talk about the idea of decentralization as an organizing structure. We're going to talk about legitimized violence through the mechanism of police. And then we're going to talk about the types of militant and violent movement activities that we see anti-fascists engaging in. And then we're going to end by talking a little bit about the escalation we see in the current climate. So classical theory went through a couple of changes. We started with this idea of people who engage in protest are mad, both meanings of that. So partially it's that they are not in their right mind, and partially it's that they're very angry. And then we saw Manker Olson come in, and he was like, if you join the protest, this doesn't make any sense. It's not rational choice. Why would you join the protest if the other people are protesting and you can just get all the benefits of it? And we see that happening, right? Anti-fascists are out there, militant anti-fascists are on the street doing the things that we want to see happening, right? We want to see anti-racism, we want to see gender equality, we want to see trans rights. But there's only a subset of us who are out there taking the time out of our day to physically make that happen. And then the basis for my work is this idea of repertoires of contention. So Charles Tilly was like, movements can only engage in the type of tactics that they're aware of. If you don't know about new stuff, then you're not going to do that because that's not an option for you. And tactics end up being a resource for the movement. So if you're good at petitioning or organizing protests, then that's what you're going to do, and you're just going to keep doing it because you have that skill set and that set of resources with connections. But one of my favorites, Donatella Della Porta, talks about this idea of how we have a progressive system of radicalization. And while horseshoe theory isn't super well received in the academic circles, this is this idea that as we move away from the middle, no matter whether we're moving to the right or to the left, we end up with this similar set of tactics and even almost ideology, right? Several of the scholars have said that particularly the news compares anti-fascists and fascists, says anti-fascists are in fact fascists. And so when we look at this system of increasing radicalization, we see this happening on both sides. So it starts with your everyday sympathizers. Oh yeah, I think that cause makes sense. And then you have supporters who are like, yes, punching a Nazi is okay, but I'm not going to do it. And then you have your activists who are out on the street, but again, usually these are the people who are nonviolent, who are saying, we don't want these people with the guns here, we don't want people who are punching people, that's not helping us. And then you move all the way to your most radical people who are out there sharing these memes of the only good Nazi is a dead Nazi. The next focus of my dissertation is this idea. There is no capital A Antifa. There's no national organization. I don't have a membership card, even though the right wing, we saw lots of left wing memes, but the right wing has all these memes about your official Antifa card. I haven't gotten mine in the mail yet. In fact, part of the components of decentralization are these ideas of affinity groups that come together for specific actions. Sometimes these involve block actions, but not always. And you can see from the diagram the difference between how a centralized group works and a decentralized group. And for many, many years, we've seen most protest action happening in a centralized way. A primary organization is reaching out to all of their various networks, and they are the primary organizer, even if it's a couple of organizations. But then we start to see in anti-fascist action, we see these affinity groups, so those little individual nodes, they are in contact with each other, often through the other types of activism they do, right? We learned anti-fascists are not just anti-fascist activists. They are racial justice activists. They are feminist activists. And so these can represent different social justice groups, and they come together for, say, the CHOP. But an important part of looking at this decentralization is how does this affect the size and safety of anti-fascist action? So if there is no membership card, or if there is one and I haven't found it yet, I don't know how do you become recruited into an organization that is an underground or clandestine organization. And again, Donatella Della Porta speaks about this idea of often people engage in radical behavior before they are recruited into these networks. And so you meet the person on the street doing the thing, and then you're like, hey, I'm in this small group of people and we did this other thing. Maybe in the future we can get together and do this third thing. And so that's a way to recruit people into these small decentralized groups, but at the same time, because we know that the state infiltrates these organizations, how do we avoid inviting infiltration and co-optation into these affinity groups is an important question that I don't yet have the answer for, but I hope that maybe by next year when we do this, I'll have some good data to share that with you. So ACAB, right? We see this in our leftist memes, this idea that all cops are bad, all cops are bastards. And this sentiment comes all the way from the punk rock scene in the UK in the 80s. I was going to share my slides because that is a link to this song at the very bottom, which I'm not going to play. But so again, Della Porta and Tilly both tell us that while we think about violent protesters, and the media, particularly Fox News, tells us that anti-fascists are these violent people, it is the case empirically that the people who are committing the most violence at protest actions are the state. And this has historically been the case throughout a variety of social justice movements dating all the way back to before the civil rights era and happening in Europe a lot. So we see Randall Collins has a microsocial understanding of violence in the interpersonal, and most of this violence, whether it's by the activists or by the police, is against the unarmed. So it's easier to attack somebody from behind. It's easier to attack somebody if you have the upper hand. And we see the police, we talk about we don't rely on cops. That's a principle of most organized anti-fascist groups. Organized? I thought I couldn't join them. You can't rely on the cops because we've seen in Oregon and in other places that they stand down. They wait. They're not choosing to engage. And in some of the most violent clashes in Portland, we have the evidence that the police just chose not to be there even though they knew. And so when we think about the state, we have to think about how they play into this notion that the right wing and the left wing are the violent people engaging in this interplay, because there's a three-way fight going on. And as somebody in this room said, we see anti-fascists acting as their own internal police force even before they create these autonomous zones. So let's look at some of the tactics that anti-fascists engage in that are not well received by the media, but seem to be the ones that are out there making the biggest difference. And so the ones people know the most about is this black bloc, right? We see all of these people disguising their faces, wearing similar outfits. And in our more modernized times, right, we're seeing innovative use of disguises, this face paint that avoids facial recognition software. Online, people use sarcasm as an effective way to be engaged in everyday anti-fascism and to encourage others to act. So my favorite one is, I wouldn't say that you should. It would be such a shame if you did. I didn't say that you should. And then, of course, right, we have doxing. It goes on both sides. And we know that when this list came out, a young man went to Brett Kavanaugh's house with intent of committing violence. And so There is an intent of violence, but we do have to recognize that it is a different intent of violence than when fascists dox us, right? No platform. So that photo is from Penn State just last week. So anti-fascists don't believe that we should have space for fascists to be spouting their hateful rhetoric, especially in all manner, but this particular event was billed as a comedy show. It's not particularly funny to be transphobic or homophobic or just full of hate. And so Gavin McInnes was scheduled to appear here. The university said we can't cancel his event because he has a free speech right and free speech is protected on campus. Anti-Fascists said we're going to come and protest. They did. Proud Boys said we're going to come and protest. They did. The campus police stood down as long as they could. And 45 minutes before the event was scheduled to take place, they decided that there was too much of a risk of violence, and they did eventually cancel the event. But there was already violence happening, so it was a little bit late for that. We, as you can see from the images that have been on the whole time, we see engagement in property destruction, but particularly oriented at corporate places as well as the police. And this has a legacy dating all the way back to the World Trade Organization and beyond. And then, as I mentioned, Randall Collins has this idea of the violence threshold. So it's very hard to commit violence against someone when you can see their face. And this is true even for soldiers. The data suggests that when you can see their face, it's extremely hard to attack another person. But when they're running away and you have significant numbers, now it gets easier to engage in this degree of violence. And that's worth thinking about when we're going out, and if we're going out and protesting, that we should be thinking about the idea of safety in numbers. So we continue, we're living in a moment of escalation, right? So on the right, you have some of the pictures from Jane's Revenge attacking, defending abortion clinics. If abortions aren't safe, then you aren't either. And then we have anti-fascists on the left, pepper spraying some Make America Great people. And as we continue to escalate, we have to think about what that means for our political process, right? So several of the scholars yesterday talked about electoral anti-fascism, and I think that there's a disconnect between the street anti-fascism and the electoral anti-fascism, and we have to think about what impact one has on the other. It's hard to get people to vote on your side when your side is represented by these images, right? It's hard to get people to be sympathetic to, well, I defend all these rights of all these people, but I'm also out here on the street engaging in violence. I need interviewees. So if you are active in militant anti-fascism of any kind, it does not have to be violent, of course, please take down my contact info. If you know other anti-fascists, please share my contact info. And then I have a slide with questions and answers, but you can just come up here and talk to us. So I promised to be brief. Everybody took a really long time, but I don't have a ton of data yet. So here's my overview, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Heather. And so I'm going to, as we assemble to get everybody on the stage and the screen goes up, think about your questions. You can actually line up before you even have a question, because you might have a question by the time you get to the microphone. The microphone seems to be missing, though, so, oh, there it is. It's way in the back. Okay.
Hello.
Okay, we've got that. And then we will make our way up to the
If anyone
stage.
doesn't have a question,
Can we-
I do, so, but
Yeah, thanks.
I'll defer to anyone else.
Okay, can you hold off till we sit down? Just for a second, just think about it. Yeah, just wait till we go up there. Thanks. Yeah, there we go. That's fine. Okay. Is this on? Yeah. All right. So, first question, please. Thank you.
My name is Barry Cohen. So this question is directed to Paul, but implicitly, I guess, any of you could address it in just a slightly different version. And this is a question I'm thinking somebody in the audience at your defense might pose to you. Let's take one specific part of your data set. You talk about those who are believe in the elitist and believe in the anti-elitist. So my question is, did you consider looking at the actual elites in society and considering whether those beliefs correspond more or less to the reality? Because it seems like there's this way of talking about, I believe in elites on the right, and I believe in elites on the left. I think you made reference to some particular individuals. And presumably there's these people in the middle who don't believe in elites or don't talk about them. So what's the reality? And does it matter what reality is? So I think this is a question that confronts, and implicitly, I think that the question comes up in relation to everything where you're trying to actually, we're not just having a discourse which is disconnected with the real world of power, of property, of wealth. We're talking about affecting discourses, belief systems, modes of interaction that affect those things. So the same thing when you're engaging in some tactics. The question is, a tactic is a way of accomplishing an objective. What is the objective? How do you measure whether you've moved towards that objective or not? Okay, so you see which way the question is going. And for an academic who's researching these things, hey, this is a fantastic opportunity to collect data. So if you've gotten to the point of your defense and somebody says, where's your data on this subject? What's the response?
Yeah, is this on? It is. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, thinking about the data, I could think about it from a few different perspectives. I think it would be helpful to see not only how this works among the mass public, but also how this works among elites, which I think would be, a separate data set, because mine's just kind of a nationally representative of the mass public in terms of gender, age, geographic region, and so on. I think there's also this kind of question of political engagement. And what about people who are less politically engaged? What do these appeals do to them? And I actually have a political engagement measure in my survey experiment, so I can luckily assess an interaction effect between the populist appeal and the political engagement pretreatment covariate. So that's an excellent recommendation. So thank you. Others?
All right, we'll move to the next question. If you can also just, if you want to, say your name or anything about yourself, just so we kind of know.
Bill Bernstein. Okay. The theoretical presentations that we heard, from the panel are fine, but I think there's a larger elephant in the room that is, begging for some recognition. Okay. And that's the January 6th committee. So I'm sure you, as I, if you watched any or all of the hearings, came to the conclusion that they were absolutely brilliant, and one became more brilliant than the last. The last one, the one which Cassidy Hutchinson presented at the end of the summer, I said, what? As brilliant as I think this is, what does the other side think of it? Because ultimately that's extremely important. So to do that, and these are the anti-fascist extraordinaire that are making those presentations. They may save us if we're to be saved. But at any rate, so where do I go to find out? So that night, I turned on Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson that night first had a presentation on Hillary Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Benghazi, extremely appropriate for the moment. The second presentation had to do with Nancy and her relationship with them. And the third had to do with great replacement theory. The end of the program came. Not once did January 6th pass the lips of Tucker Carlson that night. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, what does the other side think about what happened? Okay. And the answer is they didn't hear it, or they didn't want to hear it.
Okay, do you have a question for the panelists?
Yeah, I'm getting to it.
Or can you get to it pretty quickly, please?
All right. Where are we now? In a week or two, we'll know what the results of this election are. What we know for sure, however, is that there will be a lot more election deniers in positions of power somewhere in the country doing something. Okay? Ultimately, that leads to the election 2 years from now.
Okay, that's a great lecture. We would like a question, please, for the panelists. Can you just form it in the form of a question, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Ultimately, somebody is going to win the 24 election. If it's the Democrat who gets more popular votes than the Republican, which has been the case in 6 out of the 7 last elections, the far right, the fascists, very likely will have a problem with that. And the problem will be essentially that they stole the last election from us. We're not going to let them do it again. So Donald Trump, who has just a propensity...
Yeah, I would recommend that you submit a paper for a conference like this, because that would be great.
It's not a paper. It's much too short, because I'd like your answers to this. When they mobilize and Trump says something stupid like it's time to march, which is essentially what happened a few years ago, what do we do then? And I'd like your comments on what you think about that.
So basically, what is to be done? If nobody has a response,
I can. Yeah, I thought Heather was getting ready. Yeah, you seem ready to go.
Well, I mean, if 2020 is an indication, we'll go out and we'll raise our fists and we'll yell and we'll be in mass mobilization. But if we believe in the electoral process, it's not like we can throw a coup, right? If the result, we had the opportunity now to get rid of the electoral Congress, electoral college. If that's what's in place, and the result is that the right-wing populist candidate wins by the process that we have, then we only have the electoral process in order to change that. I don't think we're about to have an anti-fascist coup.
Yeah, I agree. That seems very reasonable. At least where I'm coming from, I'm not very comfortable making predictive claims based on like who wins which elections. But like that seems, well-founded.
The only thing I'd add is Mueller has a 2016. Mueller's a professor at Princeton, has a 2016 book on populism, and he talks about how in the populist imagination, the populist can't lose. And the idea is, if you're thinking from the perspective of the populist and the populist mind, the populist represents the true people. And because he has the mandate from, in his or her mind, the true people, the populist, by the populist definition, represents the majority. And so the idea that, a populist, a person, a politician who represents the majority could lose an election is not valid. And so he talks about this in 2016 in his book, Mueller. And of course, we saw that play out in 2020. So I'd refer you to that book because I think it's fascinating.
Thanks.
Okay, I had to actually take notes. My name is Grzegorz Piotrowski. I came from Poland, so I have questions to Paul and to Heather Ann, or rather, some of them are comments, but coming from a different populist setting. I was wondering if you included in your research design the issue of emotions that are really often played out by populists, both from the left and from the right, which is actually also, I think, a path to a successful counter-populist strategy, or like a counter-right-wing populist strategy. And here are the works of Joël de Velle or Yves Meny, who pinpoint the role of emotions in constructing the elites. Because you said it's anti-elitist, but one of the biggest paradoxes of populists is that Donald Trump became a populist, being anti-elitist, himself being a big part of the elite, right? So I was wondering where the emotions are, and at agency, who gets to name who are the elites? Because in Poland, for instance, is the judicial system who are the enclosed elites, and to some extent medical doctors, but not big capitalist owners, which is also in left-wing populism the way of creating this anti-elitism, and that we're not the elites, we are the true folk that actually hold the virtues of the area or the working class, depending on political stance. And the second question to Heather Ann is you mentioned decentralization and so on. There is a vast literature on calls for action and etc. Like the mechanism that actually you don't have an organizing committee, but you have someone pitching in the idea and then people gather around it. But I was wondering, have you included David Graeber's work on structure as part of the ideology? It comes from his book on direct action. And I think that actually would respond to the question you posed on that slide, at least. And also, one comment, Donatella Laporta said more about previous engagement in activism rather than radicalism. That comes from her early studies in the 70s when she did research in Italian prisons, investigating people from Lotta Continua and similar groups, that she found out that they were previously engaged, for instance, in Christian and Catholic groups, but they're not radical. They radicalized later, and that's actually what her work was based upon. So thanks.
Do you mind if I take the first part real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Most of my outcome questions that I asked, and I didn't go into detail in this in the talk, but were basically multiple choice in the sense of a battery of questions about legitimization of the candidate, a battery of questions about legitimacy of whoever the candidate attacked, and then a battery of questions about support for violations of democratic principles. After that, I had like a text box where people could where I just asked, how do you feel about the populist talk that you just heard? And I haven't yet had time to kind of go through and do a text analysis or use some of the fancier techniques like structural topic modeling to see, what are the big emotions that are coming to the fore. I think that's a good next step. And I think that's kind of the main response I had. Yeah.
I also am looking to bring in emotion. I really enjoyed Francesca Paletta's book, It Was Like a Fever. And so I'm trying to look at this idea of connecting the structural with the emotions at the micro level. And I'll definitely have to look into that earlier Della Porta work because I read Clandestine Political Violence and then her radicalization piece from 2018. But I'll look at that engagement piece. Thank you.
Oh, and just one more quick response as I'm thinking about it. One thing that I did notice, I did just kind of skim over the qualitative response, like how do you feel about this candidate? One thing that was interesting was it wasn't just in the, basically across conditions. So whether it was just, subjects just shown a politician talking about an issue like COVID or like student debt plus the populist appeal across conditions, I saw this like undercurrent of like anti-elitism among the responses. And this is kind of just a qualitative assessment, but there's a sort of like undercurrent of like, oh, it's a politician. We know they're just saying what we want to hear. And so it was just kind of anecdotally kind of interesting to me to see that undercurrent, even, kind of regardless of what the text was.
Paul, I'd love to look at your qualitative data.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Oh, the mic feedback is tough.
Yeah, next question.
So I have a question specifically for Paul. One of the key aspects of right-wing populism is, or I should say, in addition to anti-elitism, right-wing populism also has a position of like sort of pushing down, right? And looking at, so there's illegitimate elites, and then there's also parasitic people who are supposedly sort of on the bottom of the social hierarchy who are trying to like attack that producerist narrative. Right. So how does that fit into your model of elitism and your construction of populism?
Yeah, I mean, I think on one level we could think about heterogeneity among who is this most effective for, and the populism literature would basically say rural, white, low income, less education. It's the people that we would expect this the populist appeal to be stronger for. But another point is, and I should have made clear in my talk, is my research was on just kind of what I call base populism, but just Mudé's basic definition of anti-elitism mixed with the good people's thwarted will. And it's worth emphasizing that far-right populism and the far-right populist appeal, according to Mudé, would combine that plus nativism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. And I think I wanted to, in terms of thinking about my research agenda, I wanted to start out with kind of the most basic, parsimonious of just like, how do these appeals work? I think a next step is, what's the heterogeneity or other outcome questions like emotions? And then I'd like to kind of get into, not just a sort of a base populist appeal, but what about far-right populist appeals? What about like patently fascist appeals? It's a whole research agenda that's going to take probably multiple papers to execute. Thank you.
And it also seems, I'll just jump in, that xenophobia, I don't know if that was one of the questions as well, right? So the othering that happens both about who is not the people, and how the elite either are part of those others in the case of anti-Semitism, or in the case of like Biden and immigration, right? There's an affinity there that allows the elites to be seen as weak because they have this affinity for the other. Right?
Yeah, and there's always another, because whether it's left populism, right populism, far right populism, there's always a circumscription of we when the populist makes the appeal. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi,
Next question.
thanks. My name's Chris. I'm a history teacher and guidance counselor. Just a few just quick things. Just to answer the question of the fear of the rise of a potential fascist. I think the answer is rather simple, actually, and it has nothing to do with rhetoric. It's policies. If the government would respond to the needs of the people, passing things like Medicare for all or free college tuition, things like that, you would see that policies that are very popular would do away with the rhetorical problems that potentially are happening. And I think that's what the populists were originally all about. The populists, their problem was they were for women's right to vote, right? That's what the populists originally stand for. They were for a graduated income tax. Their problem with the elites was that they controlled the railroads and they were destroying the local farmer. And one of the things that you could research is in North Carolina, they created the Fusion Party, which was the party of Lincoln, the Republicans at that point, with the populists. And they came together as one, and they won seats. They won seats all across, and they fought for, again, women's right to vote. The Fusion Party also included black farmers, because a lot of the farmers in North Carolina are black, and we don't think of that. We always think of, like, this angry white. So anyway, I just think that part of your research, if you look at the Fusion Party in North Carolina, would be really good. And I think part of the anti-fascist movement needs to be policy related and not just rhetorical. Pass policies that the people of the United States or of the world want. Where's the money going? It should be going to the communities, and that would diminish the rise of the fascists. The Rust Belt is rusty for a reason, and to just they're all deplorables, as opposed to they actually have some legitimate grievances where the money has been filtered off to the 1%. That is legitimate, and I think populists and fascists are not the same. I think populists come from the idea that they are actually the people in need. And I was just, as you're looking at that research, don't you see a massive difference in some ways? Or am I wrong? I mean, again, the populists wanted women's right to vote, the direct election of senators. They increased democracy as opposed to decrease democracy, as what fascists would do.
Yeah, what's interesting too is how, I don't know if you've looked at Howe and Moe's work, but in their work they actually argue that we should have sort of tweaking of our democracy. For example, as it's currently written, it would technically be a violation of separation of powers for the president to introduce a bill, to do X, right? That's not how our, as you and others know, that's not how the system of government in the U.S., for example, works. But what Howe and Moe argue is, well, if doing that would create policy that more directly responds to the people's needs, then perhaps that would be a more democratic. Yeah. Yeah, so I would just refer you to Howe and Moe's work. I think they would agree with you.
President of the United States, Joe Biden, he's part of the Democratic Party. He could just get the Democratic Party to introduce the bill and push forward. So I don't think there's any less power in that sense.
And so could a Republican, right?
Yeah, of course.
Then we agree.
hello. Jeremy Sarakin from St. John Fisher. I want to thank you for the suggestions you make. Paul, I just ordered Mueller's book on Amazon, so I thank you. It's already happened. I had a question for Heather Ann. I'm very much interested in sort of the tactics and studying those and reading more about those, like the sarcasm examples with the jamming the hotlines, thankfully, in Texas. Are there any good studies or books sort of that go into that more, or has that been studied?
I haven't seen that yet.
Oh, something to do. Okay, thank you. That was my hope.
I refer to you to my future work in about 2 years.
So I'm going to ask a question as one of the rhetoricians in the room, sharing your discipline. And this is not a question just for Matthew, though. It's a question really for just about anyone here who wants to answer it. And I'm going to be channeling Adolf Reed, and I'm actually going to be channeling the guidance counselor who spoke before me. One of the things that I find really interesting about this conference, and quite frankly surprising, is other than, I think Allie was an exception, maybe a couple of other people, no one's really answering the question, where's the persuasion? I don't see how I'm someone who has done a lot of work on 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century anarchism, a lot of work on Sacco and Vanzetti, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things I've found about anarchists historically, and I think is true of anarchists in the present, is they're really great on analyzing the problem. And they're awful on proposing a solution. I mean, you don't look to anarchists for solutions. You look to them for tell me what the problem is, right? And we can quibble about who does offer solutions, but anarchists certainly don't. Not workable solutions in a massive nation like the United States. We're just not going to be, direct democracy, little pockets of direct. It's just not going to happen, right? So I'm thinking, like, where's the persuasion? Who's being reached by any of these things? Like Adolf Reed said, and again, like my colleague and comrade who just spoke before me, where are the things that are actually going to persuade people? This is, what can stop a fascist? I haven't heard anything really here yet that has kind of tapped into what Adolf said yesterday, which is, what we need is, it's great that we've got all these critiques. I mean, it really is terrific. But where's the constructive solution? Where are the strategies and tactics for movement building? And it's got to be a movement that includes white working class people. So I wondered if any of you could address, like, where's the persuasion in what you're seeing? Who's brought in, who isn't already in? Paul, I really enjoyed your presentation, but I also really like Thomas Frank's book on populism, and I'm kind of with Thomas Frank. If not populism, then what? And I don't want to neutralize Bernie Sanders, and I don't think that there's an equivalency between left populism, if you could even call Bernie Sanders a leftist at this point, and right-wing populism or fascism. So, if we don't, and to another comment, like, where is the kind of analysis of material conditions, right? I mean, there are some elites, as Adolf talked about yesterday, the upward redistribution of wealth has been extraordinary in the U.S. So some critiques of elites and outgroups, like if the outgroups is the owners of Twitter and Amazon, and I'm all for creating them as the outgroup, which I think is what 19th century populism did. So I was wondering if you could, any of you or anyone from yesterday, address those concerns. Like, where's the building of the movement rather than the description of these tactics that really aren't persuading anyone to not, they're not, as Adolf said, we're not doing anything, or we should be doing more to build those kind of movements that provide material solutions that make it really unnecessary to side with the fascists.
Yeah, I can at least answer the question about where the persuasion lies, or where it should lie, right? I think my field of specifically rhetorical criticism has gotten too comfortable with saying after the fact, like, even my presentation says, well, 2 years later, here are the rhetorical appeals at play. What would make a lot of sense, for at least my disciplinary perspective, is that we formed some sort of clearinghouse, or some sort of book, or some sort of edited collection, where you had a bunch of rhetorical scholars sit down and kind of think through which appeals are best. How do we reach people on questions related to anti-fascism, and begin thinking a little bit more towards the future instead of just spending our time analyzing text from the past, which again is kind of ironic considering that is all I do. But at least some of what I'm trying to at least persuade folks in my discipline to do is push forward more with more forward thinking, more like consciously political types of work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that a bunch of rhetorical scholars are the people I would ask for what kinds of appeals would work.
Sure.
To create a more robust democracy, but sure.
Sure. I also think it's definitely an interdisciplinary effort, right? I think that we could be doing a better job, at least in rhetorical studies, of reaching across aisles, both to folks who are not in our discipline, but also folks like who are not academics. I don't think we do a great job of that right now, and hopefully that changes. I'd like to see more rhetorical scholars at conferences like this.
So your comment made me want to look at my data again and look and see if I look at people below a certain income, for example, is there a bigger effect, right? I think the populism literature points to kind of economic, cultural, and psychological determinants of populist support. And so I think if we kind of look at the populism literature in aggregate, it wouldn't just be material ailments being addressed that would sort of end this appetite for populism. So, in Norris and Englehart's work, right, they try to adjudicate, is it economic or cultural factors that serve as an engine for populist support? In their cross-country analysis, they find cultural factors are one of the biggest drivers of populist support. So, I thought Adolf had made excellent points yesterday, and I agree with a lot of the points about how can we, the question, how can we make capitalism more inclusive? But there are additional, I think, cultural and psychological challenges that even more inclusive capitalism wouldn't address.
I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm not sure that the goal is to convince everybody. Anarchists, I don't know that anarchists want to take control of this whole giant country, and anarchist policies of horizontal leadership styles, we couldn't do that on a mass scale. So direct action, we talk about the memification of the alt-light, and if it works for them, then I don't see why we should believe that the punch a Nazi memes aren't recruiting people who don't want to punch Nazis, who are like, what is happening here and what can I do? And so I think there is an alt-light left, I guess. And I think we are convincing people. We're seeing the numbers grow. Anti-fascism was in a nadir during the Obama era, and we're seeing these huge numbers now. But we're not going to form a political party. We're not going to see an anarchist party or a majority in the government. And if electoral anti-fascism is our goal, we need 300 Congress people to make policy changes. We have, 2 Democratic Socialist people in Congress? I just don't know that an electoral solution is the goal of direct action. And I think there is evidence that we are recruiting more people.
I didn't mean, if I implied that, I didn't mean to. That's kind of what I was saying. That's why we can't have an anti-fascist movement that is primarily anarchist. That's my point, is because direct action is wonderful, but as my comrade back here said, how do we need policy, and we need a movement that is inclusive, and I would we're losing. We are losing this fight. I think Adolf Reed is right, and I'm not sure that any of the strategies that have been outlined are going to move us in a different direction.
But what's winning?
Yeah, exactly. This is if you have, I would agree. I'm going to move on this too. So I think if you have to focus so much on persuasion and appeal, you already lost. Because who is it that it needs to be appealed to about anti-fascism? For instance, right? If that's your goal, okay, if you're putting so much into it. However, that's not to say that anti-fascism isn't appealing or isn't a draw. And I think anarchists do more than analyze. Actually, they're building stuff. They built Chaz, they built CHOP. And people show up, and guess what happens? the state hates it. The cops have to break it down. And where's the left? Well, we can't be that defunding of the cops. So because we need to persuade the public because we have an election coming up, so we have to play it safe, right? So I would say the problem is not the lack of appeal. It's actually a left that is so far into persuasion that it actually won't defend the experiments, the radical experiments that are happening across this country. And they've happened around women on college campuses protesting against fraternities and looking to abolish the fraternities. The left is afraid of abolition. So until that happens, I think there's this hand-wringing about every election and appeal to a public. So, but that's my cultural communication anarchist side.
Yeah, I have a quick question that I've actually been trying to make since yesterday, and I think it's really
You're one of the co-organizers, right?
I rush up to the microphone, and so I just push somebody aside to get to the microphone.
It's your prerogative. It's the people's mic.
We're always looking also at the experiences of the past, right? We're also drawing always these parallels. We would have had no vibrant anti-fascist movement in the past if we did not have a buy-in by labor. I mean, we can demonstrate, we can protest, we can engage in violent confrontations with fascists, which some of us here have done. But ultimately, without a vibrant labor movement, and most importantly, with a realistic, significant political alternative that goes hand in hand, we just can't be anti-something. We also have to propose something that goes along. So my question to everybody, and I really hope that this is a conversation that we can continue to have in the context of this conference, is what the fuck comes after this? I mean, how do we build something that is not just responding, having the other side define what we respond to? How do we respond to that, but then at the same time come up with our own alternative and our own. Yesterday we were talking about it, I'm thinking of Gabriel Peri's famous statement just before he was executed in 1944, the hope of the lendemain qui chante, the tomorrow that sings, right? That's what we want. And we cannot do that unless we have a buy-in from labor and unless we propose an alternative. And, I'm just throwing this out to everybody.
Thanks. Maybe we'll take the next two questions because we're running out, and then we'll just see what people want to.
Okay, I'm speaking next, so I apologize, but I was taking away from my speech. But just experiential, not based on books, right? I was involved in Jesse Jackson's campaign. We organized in West Virginia, right? Jesse was there, right? The mine workers, there was a credible assassination threat against Jesse. You know how they knew? Because the white miners there in the Union were connected in all kinds of routes and heard about it, so we had to postpone the trip. That was anti-fascist work amongst a section of the population that people tend to view as deplorable. Second, when he went up to J. May during a strike, a lot of the scabs were black, the strikers were white. Guess what? A lot of the strikers on the picket line were using racist phrases. We brought Jesse up there, and Jesse addressed the black community, and he addressed the white strikers, but the solidarity was on the Union. It was building a black and white unit. That was anti-fascist work, and I don't understand how we can talk about anti-fascist work that doesn't talk about engaging with people in real struggle. And so that, so it's not just about punching people, it's organizing people around common interests. So,
yeah.
Thanks.
I didn't know what he was going to say, but I'm just... My partner over there. I'm a longtime community organizer, and you do not walk into welfare centers or labor pools or homeless shelters and say words like capitalism or anarchism or anti-fascism because people are like, get the fuck away from me. Not because people aren't thinking about those things, but they don't know who you are. And I think it's really crucial. There are solutions out there. There are a lot of grassroots organizations that have published reports, participatory action research on solutions to the housing crisis, to workers' rights, all of this stuff. It's already out there. And you hardly ever see that kind of work in spaces like this, even though there are academics who do partner with those kinds of groups. And so I would say it's not so much about persuasion, your question or your comment about the public. It's who do we even imagine is the public? I don't agree that it's impossible to get a more progressive electoral kind of outcome. But I don't think we get that unless we have folks that are organized at the base, that even believe that in elections and that voting will make a difference. And we are running candidates that are talking about things like housing that everyone can afford, that are talking about things like Medicare for all, as the other gentleman mentioned, or police violence. And if we're not talking about things that matter to people, then electoral strategy isn't going to matter either. And the Poor People's Campaign is doing amazing work in bringing multiracial poor people together. And we sometimes, I think, I don't want to not rely on past lessons, but there's lessons all around us right now that are happening. And so that's all.
Thanks. Okay, no, we're up against time. So, Jay, come on up. Just do a quick. And then
I'll be quick. In my life, I've had the pleasure of actually knowing former Nazis, right? People that went through the process. They were, they bought the trick bag, right? The wrong bag of drugs, and they got out of it, right? They got out of it because they were part of organizing drives. So my question is, and we don't have any time, is like, why does persuasion and supporting all the awesome stuff that Heather is researching, why are those opposites? We can do both. But there has to be an organizing project that prioritizes bringing people away.
All right. A lot of things coming up. Please, just do a quick,
quick response on the labor front. I talked about this a little bit with Marianne at the beginning of the conference, but to me, one opportunity seems to be this sort of rebirth of unionization that we're seeing right now in the United States at places like Starbucks and Amazon. I am not a labor movement expert or any that's definitely not my area, but it strikes me as interesting. Like, why is that happening? Why now? And if you're thinking about particular actions or movements to support, to me that would be kind of a low-hanging fruit.
To respond to the last question, I think that when we engage in anti-fascist efforts to a large degree, regardless of is persuasion good or bad, I think all of this is a question of persuasion, because at the very goal, we have to get people invested no matter what we do. So I think persuasion is at the heart of this. It's just a question of I don't think it's persuasion and movement, it's persuasion in us doing things together.
I get nervous when I hear us repeat the right-wing talking point of that one thing she said once. I don't think that the left largely thinks of the middle of America as deplorables. I don't. I live in the South. And yes, we do need to help figure out how to bring these people in, and probably through discussion. But it's going to be one-on-one, personal level discussion, right? Belinda Robnett talks about how the civil rights movement really succeeded through this one-on-one personal recruitment strategy. And we have former Nazis because they have successfully been talked through, hey, why do you think that's right? And I think that's the basic place to start, is when you hear people saying these awful things, they're not deplorable people, they're saying deplorable things, and we have the agency to speak up and be like, why do you think that? And yes, there's no rhetoric that's gonna stop a fascist, but we can help convert them.
Okay, on that, yes, we are getting the end of the thing. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to the panelists. What a robust discussion.